How can we overcome state power? That's the question that we're going to try and tackle today as a part of this series where we're going over the limitations of authenticity. That is, what gets in the way of our authenticity, and trying to tackle those limitations and answer the question, how can we overcome them? In the last video, we talked about the personal barriers to authenticity that oftentimes come out of the parent-child relationship, the fear of death, and the fear of social rejection. And we talked about why that comes about and the specific dynamics of it, and then tried to offer up some practical suggestions as to how to approach that and how to overcome it. Now we're going to be talking about the state, the force-based government and its extensions, and how we can effectively resist or overcome state power and state violence so that we can be free to act for the sake of what we truly value. Again, we're not in this video, we're not really getting into the critiques of the legitimacy of state power or state violence. We're sort of already assuming that it is a barrier to authenticity, and we're asking, how can we overcome it? All that being said, I want to preface this video by resolutely saying I am a voluntarist in the strict political sense. I believe that a morally perfect world includes a world in which there is no force, and that includes violence, and that includes retaliatory violence. And so this kind of violence is not a method to overcome the power of the state. It's not only is it immoral, but it's also ineffective. There have been many examples in history of people trying to use violence to overcome the state, and they've all failed. And oftentimes they've failed in the worst possible way, where they sort of just create a new state, and a new state ends up being worse. I absolutely condemn any kind of state violence, any kind of violence against the state, any sort of retaliatory violence, anything like that. Every methodology that I'm going to be talking about here has to do with voluntary, nonviolent approaches to overcome state power and state violence so that we can act for the sake of what we truly value. For a world that is free of force is the first precondition for a really voluntary world, a world in which everyone can act for the sake of what they value, a world in which everybody can be authentic. Without that, there's no point. If we're interested in using violence to overcome the power of the state, then we are just cutting ourselves off at the root. We are corrupting the revolution from the beginning. And so those things are absolutely condemned from me. That being said, we know that the state and its extensions throughout society in all kinds of fields radically limits the individual's ability to act for the sake of what they truly value, and therefore to be authentic. We need to be radically free from force if we are going to live in a totally authentic world. But of course, we have a problem. And the problem is that the state forces itself on us anyway. We don't get a choice as to whether or not we live in a society that is dominated by force and violence, live in a society that is dominated by the state. It's outside of our control. It's like when a mafia takes over a town and rules it. It's not within your control as to whether or not the mafia is going to inflict themselves on you. And you sort of have to just live with it to one extent or another. But there's another layer of the problem, not just the physical force that we receive from the state, but there is the the tacit cultural approval of it, meaning that the structures of the state are such that they've incentivized people to come up with justifications for state violence. And so opposing the state culturally becomes a problem because the state has already sort of poisoned the intellectual well of culture in order to perpetuate its own power. And thirdly, you have, of course, the deep psychological incentive to keep the power of the state, and that comes about as the result of the training that children receive in relationship to their parents. The parent-child relationship, as I talked about before, prepares one for the citizen-state relationship. And so, as a child grows up, they become used to exploitative power being used against them, arbitrary power being used against them, force and violence, non-consensual force and violence being used against them. That is justified away by being for their own good. And the state, of course, uses this same kind of logic. The intellectuals and the acolytes for the state use the same kind of logic, that state power exists to regulate people for their own good. And then layers on top of that, the delusion of freedom, the delusion of choice and consent through a representational democracy that no citizen of the United States has ever consented to or had a hand in creating. And this means that a direct confrontation with the state is almost always ineffective. There are too many dependencies that have been created by the state. There's too much cultural momentum in favor of the state. There's too much individual psychological incentive to approve of the state. And just on top of that, the state carries the power of violence and force against you. And if you try to move against the state, especially if you move against it effectively, they'll simply crush you, because as an individual, you don't have that much power. And as voluntarists in general, there is not enough collective power to overcome the state in a direct way. And so you have to approach overcoming the power of the state in a sort of indirect way. And some of these we've already lightly touched upon. There is the individual freeing. This is kind of what we talked about in the last video, where you work to sort of free yourself from the training of domination that was perpetrated upon you, especially as a child, and reach for what you authentically value rather than the values that have been imposed upon you by the world around you, and do this deliberate self-discovery. And that's actually a part of the liberation process in relation to the state, because it gives you the reality of the state. It educates you on the fact that the state relationship to the citizen is about as voluntary and as authentic as the imposed values, the values that were imposed upon you by the parent-child relationship. There is, of course, a very similar dynamic there. And so that personal liberation educates you on political liberation. I also want to emphasize really quickly that my emphasis actually is not really political so much. In fact, I'm much more interested in personal liberation than I am in political liberation, because political liberation is a generational issue, whereas personal liberation is something that can happen today if you want it, and oftentimes has a greater impact on one's own personal happiness and joy and meaning than does contributing to generational liberation. Nonetheless, political liberation is an extension of individual liberation in my philosophy. So this is why I'm emphasizing and talking about it here. When you liberate yourself, it becomes more easy to see the violent domination of the state. And the violent domination of the state also becomes more irksome, because you start to recognize how much it interferes with the individual's ability to be themselves. And again, the sort of classic example here would be something like, if you are part of the LGBTQ community, you go through all the work of breaking outside of the social structures that were given to you by your society to recognize whatever your authentic sexual orientation is. And now that has made you happier. That's made you more in tune with yourself and more authentic. But your problems sort of don't end there, right? Because now you have to go and do combat with the state. You have to, um, you're always running up against state prejudice and state power. And there is no direct way to overcome that. But it is not just with authentic sexual issues that this comes about. It comes about with authenticity as a category in of itself. You can liberate yourself personally and still be dominated by the wider state power. And in in my opinion, you should focus on the personal liberation first. One, because it's a foundation for the education of liberating yourself from the state, but also because, again, it has more of a direct impact on your personal happiness. But the first strategy is the personal liberation. The second strategy is what I like to call relentless dialectic, which is like a fancy philosophical term, which just basically means radical authenticity in the wider world. This means once you have once you have become aware of the violence of the state, once you have become aware of its domination, once you've become aware of its immorality, uh, you need to be authentic in your expression of that. And this doesn't mean going up to every single person that you find and trying to convince them of the evil of the state, as much as it means being open about your thoughts and opinions in regards to the state, and not allowing yourself to hide what you think, and seeking opportunities to be able to have meaningful, open dialogue with people, and doing your best to conduct that dialogue with people in a respectful, open, and curious way. Because that's sort of the individual impact that one can have on the culture. You're essentially submitting ideas to the culture. You're asking the culture to verify them or to explore them with you, and you are not pretending to believe something that you don't believe and sort of perpetuating your intellectual domination by kowtowing to the intellectual culture at the time, regardless of what that is. It's an act of personal authenticity, but one that is geared specifically towards the political realm. You shouldn't hide your beliefs because it might generate confrontation, but you must also not at the same time try to generate confrontation for the sake of confrontation, but rather have conversations with people that are open, honest, calm, but true and forthright. And again, not hiding what it is that you actually believe about the state and its domination. So those are two, again, personal. Everything comes down to an individual action at the end of the day. And much of what I'm talking about becomes successful if it becomes more of a collective action, right? Take advantage of the state's pretense to free speech. Take advantage of it. I mean, this is what I'm doing right now as an example of that. I'm sitting here and having a conversation and putting out in a public space and inviting people to talk with me about it in order to generate not necessarily cultural impact, but at least to have the conversations out there. Because one conversation that you have with a person may seem as though it ends there, but oftentimes it reverberates down into other relationships as sort of like the 7 degrees of separation that we all have from the rest of the world. And cultural information filters out in the same way. The more you're able to have calm, curious conversations with people about what you genuinely believe about the state, the more chances there are for people to think about these things seriously, or at the very least have the opportunity to come up with counter arguments and sort of work it out for themselves, right? The third strategy is what I call radical non-participation. This is social, and it's usually more costly. I mean, it's not so much costly to be personally liberated because I mean, it is costly emotionally, you could say. Um, and it really can cost it. I'll take it back. Personal liberation can be very costly, but it's also beneficial in the end, uh, to you in particular, because you get to be your authentic self. And Relentless Dialect is largely not costly, especially if you're conducting yourself in the appropriate way with it. There's great upside in the sense that people get to genuinely think about what it is that you're talking about, and not much low side in the sense that, in terms of whether people react ignorantly or in bad faith or violently, or um, they just try to drown you in ad hominem or things like that. You can sort of just, for the most part, walk away. Of course, there's always the risk of danger, but for the most part, you can sort of just walk away. The radical non-participation can be costly. And the reason why it can be so costly is that what it is doing your best to refuse to participate in state structures or the things that keep that state structure running. So, some obvious things is like, don't be a cop, don't be a soldier, don't work for the government, don't work in a post office, don't work for a corporation, um, don't involve yourself in um, the patriotic cult movements like the 4th of July. Um, don't involve yourself in the state. And the argument for doing this basically comes down to the state only exists because people work for the state. If there were no soldiers, if there were no cops, if there were no postmen, if there were no bureaucrats, if there were no politicians, if there were no people willing to work for corporations, if there were no people willing to participate in the cult of the state, then the state would collapse because it wouldn't be able to find people who are willing to participate in it. And at the very least, for now, in the West, you can decide not to participate in these kinds of things without there being any great threat to your freedom or your life. The United States in particular has to pretend that it's about freedom. And so it often allows citizens to voluntarily participate in government organizations or state organizations. And your job as a voluntarist is to begin with, at the very least, not to participate in these kinds of things. If you're a police officer, get out. If you're a post worker, get out. If you work for a bureaucracy, get out. If you work in social services, get out. If you work in any of these sort of state-dominated industries that are the wheelhouse and the mechanism for domination in a country, and you have the chance not to participate in that, then don't participate in it. The less people that participate, the less the state is able to function. This can be costly depending on how dependent it is, right? And you can take this to another level where you are willing to refuse handouts or subsidies or benefits from the state. And I'm not going to moralize about taking benefits from the state, because there are certainly people in circumstances which need help, right? The state has created such havoc and chaos in our lives that we often have to then turn to it in order to keep us alive. It's like an abusive boyfriend who you depend on to feed you and house you. It's like you kind of have to turn to them and accept what they give you. But at the same time, you want to be radically oriented to getting yourself out as soon as possible. And so when it comes to a lot of these dependencies, it's the attitude is something like, take what you need, but really do try your best to get away from it, because that dependency makes you a part of the system, which ultimately, in the long run, continues to corrupt people and continues to strangle their ability to be authentic in a categorical way. But it ultimately comes up to an individual judgment. It's not for me to decide individually what benefits you are and aren't going to take. Health insurance, for example, is one of the big ones where you can refuse to take state health care, but if for whatever reason you're uninsured and you have to go to the hospital, you're just sort of immediately bankrupt, and that destroys your ability in the future to survive in a lot of ways. And that isn't really the fault of the individual, that's the fault of the state. And it's the fault of the people who involve themselves directly in the state and in a state power. And I would say the more closely related to the violence in particular, the more you are culpable for it. And so soldiers and police in particular are, I would say, far more culpable than a post office worker. There's degrees of moral culpability here, but and I would say a post office worker is probably more morally culpable than somebody who receives benefits through the state. There are degrees of moral culpability here, but the idea of radical non-participation is as far as you can, in terms of an attitude, disassociate from the state. The less people participate, the less the state can function. At the same time, and this again depends on individual circumstances and what you're capable of doing and what you're capable of providing. But as radical participation, as radical non-participation progresses, the functions of the state get worse and worse. As the state disintegrates, the functions of the state get worse and worse. This is sort of what's going to happen anyway as the state financially falls apart. But state services fall apart, right? And they don't sort of just automatically come up from the citizens. State has created this dependence of citizens on them through monopolizing all these different forms of society, whether it's healthcare and food and safety nets and technology and safety and protection and all these different industries and all these different fields of society that the government has its hands in. As the state gets worse and worse at protecting those functions, it's not sort of like it automatically comes up or there's automatically an alternative to this that already exists. It's up to individuals to come together and to start to develop, again, another philosophical term here, but parasystems. And parasystem is something that is a sort of voluntary grassroots organization that exists to provide or to fill in the gaps as the state-run systems or the violence-based systems sort of disintegrate and fall apart. So a voluntarily based community care center might come up to replace something like state-funded healthcare. And of course, that's a very complex task. So I'm not saying that this would be easy or that every individual could build it. But the point is to say, as the state systems fall apart, there becomes this need for voluntary organizations to come up and replace them instead, or for individuals to provide, in one sense, voluntary services. It's kind of like what I'm doing right now. Again, I try to follow these principles in my life myself. So, for instance, pretty much ever since I became a voluntarist, or recognize the evil of state violence, I tried to avoid it. There was at one point where I thought about going into the military, decided not to go into the military because it was immoral. There was a point at which I was thinking about going to college and getting a degree in maybe economics or philosophy and trying to become a professor that way. And I decided to reject that path because I needed state funds in order to go to school and do all that kind of stuff, since I couldn't fund it privately. Couldn't fund it privately because the state had become so monopolized in the education department that its subsidies had actually driven up the cost of education way beyond what it should be. And they also have monopolized the education system. But, you get a lot of these state-funded universities, and even the so-called private universities are not as private because the state determines standards, the state determines the state has many protections in the way of these private universities for real competition to actually come and challenge them in any sort of meaningful way. So I educated myself individually. I mean, especially when it comes to something like philosophy, it's something that you can sort of read and think about on your own, write about on your own. And that's precisely what I did. And now I'm sort of providing a service as far as I can. I mean, this is an example of me learning and hopefully getting better at explaining what I'm talking about and providing a service. But this is an example of a parasystem. Instead of education being something that's dominated by the state, education can be something that is shared at a grassroots level from people who are competent in their field, right? And you sort of allow the market to judge the worth of the content that's being given. So I'm trying to provide philosophical content. Obviously, this is not like explaining what philosophy is or philosophy 101 or something like that. This is an opinion, right? Or a philosophical thought, but it's an example of a parasystem where I'm sharing my thoughts and knowledge um, regarding philosophical topics for other people to examine, enjoy, think about, conversate with, object to, and sort of develop their own thoughts on these kinds of things. And again, it lives and dies based on whether or not it actually has value to the people receiving it, and not on whether the state is protecting it from competition or protecting it from the market, as it does so often when it comes to public universities and really just the university system in general, the college system in general. Um, it's no real surprise to me that the vast majority of philosophy professors in general, but philosophy professors as well, are pro-state, right? Because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, and the very few who are supposedly anarchist are inevitably anarchists in the sense that they approve of different forms of violent coercion. They're not actually interested in voluntarism. They're interested in their own understanding of coercion or how coercion should be spread, right? So this is an example of a parasystem that I'm doing right now, at least the beginnings of developing a parasystem, because as the education system collapses, as less and less people are actually interested in investing themselves in a university or college because they recommend that real education, they recognize that real education can come through other areas, then they're more and more likely to turn to sources like this that can provide them with actually real quality content. Not saying that what I'm doing right now is super quality. Again, I'm preparing, I'm trying to build something, but uh, I do hope to build something that is of quality. And that's what I mean in terms of this development of parasystems, getting yourself involved in something that can replace a violence-based, state-based dependent solution as that system falls apart, because people are less and less are engaging in it voluntarily less and less. And the last element, and this is specifically related to the parent-child dynamic, because as I talked about before, the parent-child dynamic is really the birthplace of the training for the state. And whether it's on purpose or whether it's not is really besides the point. But the same difference applies, that the parent-child relationship trains a child for um, dominance by the state in the future. And while this cannot be 100% solved, because there is always the sort of evolutionary tendency for the child to change itself in order to please its parents, no matter how the parent behaves, it can't. The power of that lesson and the power of that habit can be radically decreased by how a parent teaches their child. Meaning that for the parents out there who have children, the degree to which you can parent voluntarily, parent peacefully, parent without using force, threats, violence, um, and essentially exerting your power over the child in a form of domination, the degree to which you can parent voluntarily is the degree to which the instinct towards inauthenticity is weakened and the instinct towards authenticity is strengthened. And not only that, but actively help the child to understand who they are and give them the freedom to act for the sake of what they value authentically, rather than imposing your own values on them in an attempt to socialize them. There's plenty of criticisms that come up in against peaceful parenting. We're not really going to get into them. We'll get more into the criticisms of all these kinds of things when I do the videos on sort of common objections to the philosophy I've been laying out across these various videos. But the point is really just to emphasize that if the parent-child relationship ends up training the child for domination, the degree to which the domination is actively used by parents against their children for the sake of socialization or convenience for the parent is the degree to which that instinct for inauthenticity and the false self is heavily reinforced, and the degree to which the child in the future is going to have to struggle with becoming free. And the more likely they are to actually be interested in not just state violence, but authoritative state violence. Boyd DeMoss did this interesting survey of Germany and of Europe in general that talked about the kind of parenting that preceded Nazi Germany in World War II, and it was sort of a uniquely masochistic form of parenting, a uniquely violent, uniquely dominating form of parenting compared to the rest of Europe. And this was the psychological precedent to a country, a nation of citizens that was willing to accept the violence of somebody like Hitler, for example. This is just one example. Lloyd DeMoss is a psychohistorian who's pretty interesting to read into. There's a book called Parenting for a Peaceful World by Robin Grill, and Robin Grill, I believe he's a psychologist, but the book is essentially him summarizing the work of Lloyd DeMoss in a historical account of childhood and its relationship to the authoritarian states. But suffice to say that there is a strong connection between how we parent children and how those children respond to power in the future. If you parent children in a dominating, violent way, if you use force, threats, and domination to sort of get your way and socialize the child is more prone to accept violence in the future against them. And state forms of violence in particular. But the more we treat children as human beings and we negotiate and we talk to them openly, and we don't try to dominate them, we don't try to use force and violence against them, we try to help them to actually understand themselves and to be authentic. The more we do that, the less that children, when they grow up to become adults, are willing to accept state forms of domination and personal forms of domination. And so parents can have a really strong impact on overcoming the power of the state by becoming peaceful, by becoming voluntary, by not abandoning teaching the child, not abandoning instilling in them values, but doing so in a voluntary way, doing so in a way that you would with, another adult or another human being, and giving much more respect to the child than is often given by parents who sort of, again, dominate the child for their own convenience. Peaceful parenting is something that we'll get into in a different video. We'll talk about in more complexity, and I'll talk more about the objections, but I don't sort of have the space in this video to talk in depth about it. I did just want to highlight it as one of the structural methods for ending the power of the state and getting us towards a more voluntary kind of world in which everybody can act for the sake of what they truly value. And so just going over quickly what we covered so far, I talked about personal authenticity or personal liberation. That helps to overcome the power of the state because you become educated in how the state is dominating you and its effect on personal authenticity. There is Relentless Dialectic, in which you openly, honestly, curiously engage with other people about your thoughts on state power. and you are unashamed to express your, I guess, political thoughts, and you are willing to sort of face confrontation so long as you are doing so in a respectful, open, and curious way. There is the radical non-participation, in which, to the extent that you are capable of doing it without endangering your own survival, you refuse to participate in any state structure, not just simply the government, but the bureaucracy, the military, the police, and the extension of those, like state hospitals, state universities, and corporations. And then we also had the development of parasystems, in which you try to voluntarily engage in organizations or on an individual level, to create systems, organizations, or services that can replace the crumbling structures of the state with voluntary services, voluntary organizations, and voluntary solutions to the dependencies that the state have created but can no longer provide for, so that people have an alternative to choose from. And then last, we talked about peaceful parenting, how if you can make your relationship with your children as peaceful and as voluntary and as authentically oriented as possible, then you undercut the psychological incentive to conform oneself to the dominant state as they become adults. And this is really generational change. And that's what I'll emphasize here with every single one of these methodologies for overcoming the power of the state. These ultimately are all generational. They depend on many different exchanges, many different individuals becoming authentic, many different parental relationships becoming voluntary, peaceful, and authentic, many people organizing these voluntary systems, many people refusing to participate in state violence. Um, in one sense, it's a collective effort of a bunch of individuals, which is ultimately what it all comes down to. But these are all low cost in the sense that none of them confront the state directly. None of them require you becoming a martyr. None of them require you breaking any laws or anything like this. All of this can be done within the laws of most Western countries, and all of this can be done without directly confronting the state. But together, they can be very powerful for overcoming the power of the state. And if we were able to do this in a collective way, we could, again, in a very short few generations, create a voluntary society in which every single person could act for the sake of what they value in a universal way. But this is where I'm going to end the conversation on how we can overcome state power. Future videos will get into more details when it comes to this. Again, this video is a part of a series where I'm trying to do a first take or a first pass on the broad generalization of my philosophical position. Starting in the center of authenticity and moving right along as we are. And there's a reason why I'm not going into all the details. There's a reason why I'm not answering every objection. Otherwise, these videos would be probably 3 hours long, if not longer than that. As well, again, these are a first attempt to really articulate a philosophy that's been brewing in my mind for over 10 years. And I know there are mistakes, right? I know that there are mistakes and overgeneralizations. I know that I am not necessarily talking about every idea in a sort of perfect way here. This is a new medium for me, verbally articulating it, comparing it to writing. And writing, it's a lot easier. With writing, you can pause, you can reflect, you can go back, you can change things. There's a lot of editing you can do within the process itself, but with a video recording, everything kind of has to come off the top of your head, and or at least in the way that I'm doing it, because I could write a script, but I don't want to write a script. I want to be able to have, again, as authentic conversations with you guys as I can. And that means sort of doing this off the top of my head. And that means exposing myself to a lot more risk, a lot more rambling, but I would like to keep this genuine. And again, I encourage you guys, if you watch this video, if you like it, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of this, but really just engage with this. If you have thoughts about anything that I've said here, please respond in the comments. I'd love to talk with you guys about, you know, what's correct about this position, what's weak, different ideas for how to overcome state power, arguments for the sake of state power, really anything that comes to mind, any objections, comments, concerns, right? I would be so happy to read those things and to respond to you the best I can. And because really at the end of the day, these videos are about generating a conversation with you guys. Um, and just continuing to be able to have conversations about philosophy and life, with other people. So I think I'm going to end it here, but if you stuck around this far, again, thank you for listening, and talk to you guys next time.